My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, casually announced that 40 of her relatives would be spending Thanksgiving at my farm. What she said next was harder to believe. She told me I would be sleeping somewhere else, not in my bedroom, not in the house my grandfather had built in 1928. She had decided I should move into the caretaker's cottage, where there was no proper heating and only a couple of space heaters. According to her, her father needed my room because of his back. I stood in my kitchen, slowly peeling an apple, trying to understand how my own home had suddenly become someone else's property. This wasn't an ordinary farmhouse. The land stretched across 96 acres, with thousands of apple trees covering the hills. My late wife, Ruth, had built the family's roadside fruit stand into a successful business that had once employed nearly 30 people. And now my son Owen sat quietly at the kitchen table with his laptop open while his wife moved through the house giving orders. "When exactly were you planning to ask me whether I wanted 40 people here?" I asked. Vanessa barely looked at me. "They're family," she replied, "not guests." Most of those people had never even met me. She wanted Ruth's photograph removed from the dining room. She wanted our anniversary picture taken down too because she said the photographs made the room feel too private. She wanted my home to feel welcoming. I asked one simple question: "What time are they arriving?" She smiled as if I had finally surrendered, but I hadn't. 2 days earlier, something strange had arrived at my cider house. A box of expensive linen napkins embroidered with a golden apple tree and the words "Founder's Table." They had been ordered months earlier and sent to my address. The invoice was from a company I had never heard of. Then I received a call from a banker named Audrey Collins. She was checking an equity statement connected to something called the Cedar Run Hospitality Project. According to the paperwork, I had contributed my land to the project. The stated land value was $8.6 million. I told her I had contributed nothing. She asked whether I had signed a development authorization dated August 14th. I hadn't. My attorney, Margaret Shaw, immediately investigated. What she found changed everything. There was a 17-page agreement proposing a luxury resort on my property. 32 cottages, a spa, and a wedding pavilion built directly over the oldest section of our orchard. And on page 14 was my signature. Except I had never signed it. The signature had been copied perfectly from an old equipment lease. Even the tiny scanner mark was identical. Beneath my supposed signature were the names of Owen as managing member and Vanessa as chief development officer. The option price for my entire property? $8.6 million. The option fee? $10. My own son had effectively valued the land my family had spent generations building at $10 to gain control of it. But that wasn't the worst part. They had already raised more than $1 million from investors, most of them Vanessa's relatives, by telling them they controlled land they didn't own. And then I learned that nearly $100,000 had already been released from an escrow account using the forged document. I could have canceled Thanksgiving immediately. Margaret advised me to do exactly that. But I knew what would happen. They would tell everyone I was an old man who had become confused and unpredictable. So I made a different decision. I would host all 40 relatives. I would serve them dinner. And I would let the evidence expose the truth right in front of them. Because if my son had built his entire future on a lie, I wanted that lie to collapse, where everyone could see it. And what I discovered next made me realize this wasn't simply about stealing land. Someone had already started preparing for the possibility that I wouldn't be around to stop them. Margaret immediately began protecting the farm. She notified the bank, filed an affidavit disputing the land option, and started seeking an emergency order to prevent any transfer. My controller, Neil, preserved company emails and financial records. Rosa, who managed the orchard, secured the property documents and inventoried the equipment. Then the bank gave us another shock. Nearly $100,000 had already been released from escrow to a company connected to Vanessa. More money was missing. There were suspicious design invoices, unexplained referral payments, and evidence that company resources had been used to promote the proposed resort. But one discovery frightened me more than the money. Someone using Owen's login had downloaded my driver's license, several years of tax returns, and Ruth's death certificate. That meant they weren't simply preparing a business deal. They were preparing an ownership file. They needed documents that could make it appear as though everything was legitimate, even if I was no longer able to challenge it. When Vanessa told me the caretaker's cottage was ready, I refused. "I'll sleep in my own room," I said. She looked at me calmly. "You know Owen is going to own this place eventually." There was something chilling about the way she said it. She wasn't talking about inheritance as some distant possibility. She spoke as though my death were simply a date on a calendar. The next morning, I called an emergency board meeting. Margaret placed the disputed agreement in front of Owen. He refused to touch it. I asked him who had authorized the project. He called it a concept. I asked who had authorized raising money from investors using my land. He said the investors were sophisticated enough to understand the arrangement. Then I asked about the missing money. He suddenly became very quiet. Finally, I placed the old equipment lease beside page 14. The signatures matched perfectly. So did the scanner defect. "You copied it," I told him. Owen didn't answer. The board suspended him from managing the company and removed his authority over the property and financial systems. He stormed out. By Thanksgiving, 40 relatives had arrived in rented SUVs, vans, and a motorhome. Someone even parked the motorhome near Ruth's rose garden. Architectural renderings of the proposed resort were spread across my dining room. They showed white cottages replacing parts of my orchard, and a glass pavilion where Ruth's roses had grown. Owen eventually confronted me in front of everyone. "You suspended me in front of the employees," he said. "You're confused about what you signed." I realized immediately what he was doing. He wasn't trying to convince me. He was creating witnesses who would remember his version of events. So I asked him a question. What date did I supposedly sign the agreement? He couldn't answer. Then I turned toward Malcolm, Vanessa's father, and asked how much he had invested. He initially tried to minimize the amount. Eventually, he admitted he had put in hundreds of thousands of dollars. That night, around 11:20, someone quietly tried my bedroom door. It was Owen. "We just need you to tell the bank you signed it," he whispered. "Then everything goes away." I stayed silent. He reminded me that I was 72. Then he asked how long I planned to hold on to everything. I told him I would protect what I had built for as long as necessary. But the biggest revelation came the following morning. At dawn, Rosa called me. A notary named Tessa had been summoned to the property. Her stamp appeared on the disputed agreement, claiming she had witnessed me sign it on August 14th. There was only one problem. At exactly that time, I had been at a medical appointment for an eye procedure, and Owen had driven me there. Vanessa had picked me up afterward. When I confronted Tessa, she broke down. She admitted she had never actually watched me sign anything. She had been told that I had signed at home, and that the paperwork simply needed to be completed. Then she admitted something even worse. Her notary stamp had been backdated, and she had been offered financial benefits in exchange for helping them. But before she could say anything else, another message surfaced, one that could prove exactly who had planned the deception. And that message was about to turn Thanksgiving dinner into a courtroom. By early afternoon, the dining room was packed. Dozens of relatives filled the chairs while folders containing the proposed resort information sat in front of them. At the front of the room, Malcolm presented an aerial rendering of the property. The image showed the farm transformed into a luxury resort. My orchard was almost completely gone. Ruth's rose garden had been replaced by a glass pavilion. Malcolm lifted his glass. To our new $8.6 million resort. I remained seated. Then I stood. Before anyone celebrates ownership, I said, how many of you invested because you were told Cedar Run Retreats controlled this farm? Hands went up across the room. I asked how many of them had personally spoken to me before investing. Not one hand remained raised. Then I placed the old equipment lease beside the disputed agreement. I pointed to the tiny scanner mark. The signature on these documents is identical, I said. The same scanner defect appears in both. The room became silent. I explained that the disputed document had been downloaded from the company system using Owen's login. Vanessa called it a family misunderstanding. But before she could continue, the doorbell rang. Margaret walked in with a forensic accountant and a process server. Owen and Vanessa were served with legal documents immediately. There was a restraining order, a preservation notice, and a formal dispute of the land option. Vanessa insisted the money was still safe. The accountant then displayed the financial records. More than $1 million had been raised from investors. A substantial amount had been frozen. But money was still missing. Part of it had gone toward a property in Richmond titled solely in Vanessa's name. The room erupted. Owen blamed Vanessa. Vanessa blamed Owen. For the first time, the family members who had trusted them could see that neither story made sense. Then Owen tried a different argument. He suggested that I was 72, grieving, and perhaps not mentally reliable enough to challenge the agreement. Margaret immediately destroyed that argument. A recent cognitive evaluation had found no impairment. Medical records also placed me at the hospital during the exact period when the notary claimed to have witnessed my signature. And Tessa had provided a written statement admitting she never saw me sign. There was nowhere left for the story to hide. I looked around the table. The food was still there. 40 people had arrived expecting a celebration. Instead, they had witnessed the collapse of a scheme built around my land. I told everyone they were free to leave. But beginning the next morning, Margaret and the forensic accountant would meet with every investor individually and explain exactly where the money had gone. I also gave Owen and Vanessa a deadline to leave the property. Later that evening, Owen walked with me through the orchard. He mentioned an old apple tree that was scheduled to be removed because its trunk had split. "You keep destroying things just because they have a story," he said. I told him we were replacing the old trees with stronger rootstock. Then I told him something he needed to hear. He would never manage the farm while I was alive, and he shouldn't build his future around inheriting it after I died. He looked at me and said, "Maybe that meant he wasn't my son anymore." I told him being my son wasn't something he could resign from simply because he didn't like the consequences of his choices. The investigation continued for nearly a year. The resort company was eventually placed under outside control. Investors recovered much of what they had lost, though not everything. The notary surrendered her license and admitted to filing a false certificate. Vanessa eventually pleaded guilty to fraud-related charges. Owen also admitted his role in the conspiracy and misuse of company property. At his sentencing, I told the court that my son hadn't actually taken my land. The bank and legal system had stopped that. What he had taken was something harder to recover. Trust. He had used my age as both a weapon and an excuse. Old enough to be ignored when I objected, but capable enough to be used when my signature was needed. When Owen finally spoke, he didn't blame his wife. He didn't blame me. He simply said, "I chose it." For the first time, I believed him. I hugged my son afterward, not because the damage had disappeared, but because some truths survive even after terrible choices. The following Thanksgiving, only 18 people came. There were no investor folders, no resort presentation, no projector covering Ruth's photograph. Owen's daughter handed me a letter from him. He asked for nothing. No inheritance, no forgiveness. Only that I understand he finally knew what he had done. That night, after everyone left, I placed his letter in the hallway drawer beside an old child's mitten. The drawer didn't have a lock. I realized something then. Not everything valuable needs a lock. Sometimes the strongest protection is simply the truth.